Hi everyone and welcome to Exploring the Build. If you've just found this place, then welcome. And if you're returning, I'm glad to have you back. I'm Alex and this is my channel where we explore and theorycraft different character builds for Dungeons & Dragons, plus some other TTRPGs from time to time. Today I figured it would be a good time to do our 500-ish subscriber special. We did admittedly hit 500 a little while ago, and honestly I'm still amazed that we actually made it to that milestone. I appreciate all the support from everyone who likes, comments, shares, or even just views the videos. It all means the world to me. So from the bottom of my heart, I just wanted to say sincerely, thank you. Now for today's video, I did want to do something a little different than the usual build video for a subscriber special, but I still wanted to kind of incorporate a build into it since that's like the main thing we do here. Basically, I'll be sharing a character build that I played a few years back, but I also want to talk about what happened to the character at the table and share some funny D&D stories. I'll give a bit of background as to where the inspiration came from and why I chose to build this specific character, and then I'll go into a breakdown of the actual build as it was and what I played through for the levels when I did play the character. And then finally we'll end off with how they played out in practice and share some funny D&D stories. Hopefully the video will give you a bit of insight into both my methods and madness as a character builder, but at the very least I hope you enjoy the funny stories from the table. I'll be sure to put timestamps in the description down below, so if you're just interested in hearing about the actual character build and just want to get some ideas for your next character, you could just watch that part. If you only really care about the funny D&D stories, that'll be near the end, so you could just skip right ahead to that and just listen to those and have a little bit of a laugh, hopefully. And then if you wanted to see the whole thing, from the background of the character to what the actual build was, to how they played out and what sort of funny stories came from playing them at the table, then feel free to sit back and watch the full thing. Either way, let's jump right into it. Okay, so the character we're talking about today was called Rakdos. Rakdos was my first real theory-crafted character build. When I first got 5e, I did fall in love with creating characters, and I just wanted to see how I would make a character if I wanted to play X, Y, or Z. I would create characters and go through their background and like their level 1 abilities that they would get if they were a paladin, or a monk, or a fighter, and it was just fun to do. But I never really got into full theory crafting until Rakdos. Back in 2017, I got invited to join a D&D group that I met through university, actually the same D&D group that I still play with today. So we're going on about 7 years now. Now the reason I gave the year is because it's kind of important for the build. See, Xanathar's Guide had just been released that year, and I had picked that up before joining this campaign. Now the campaign itself was one that was already ongoing. The group had played like about the first half of it, and then they had a small break, and we're now getting ready to go into the second half of this overarching story. So I was going to be jumping into this campaign with a level 10 character, and until this point I had only really played characters that never made it past level 5, just because that's typically what 5e is like. You sort of stop and start and get up to around 5 or so, maybe a little longer for some tables. So suffice to say, it was definitely new character building territory, and I'd have a few levels to play around with and really try and craft a build for it. The reason I was going to want to craft a build was because of the setting. It was going to be set in Ravenloft. Essentially, the players in the first half of the campaign had chased their big bad through a portal and were now in Ravenloft. When I was told that I would be joining in a Ravenloft campaign, I initially thought Curse of Strahd, because I wasn't aware of the old Ravenloft campaign setting, at least not at the time. We were sure enough going into the full Ravenloft setting, and this was before 5e had revamped their version of Ravenloft. That meant that we were going into the old school setting. The reason that's kind of important is because the DM set it up to basically say this was going to be a grimdark campaign that's going to be quite a slog. It's going to be difficult, and there might still be character death. He was going to pull no punches and just send everything at us, since we're all a party of level 10 characters and we're meant to be in this gothic, horror-esque campaign setting. Thus, everything was set up for not only creating a first theory-crafted character, because we had 10 levels to play with, but also that we wanted to make a character who was going to be able to survive. I wanted to do a bit of optimizing in order to make sure that he could hold his own against whatever the DM chose to throw at us. Thus, Rakdos was born, and to this day, I still consider him to be my favorite build that I've ever made, because the mechanics and theme that went into his character just blended together so well. So what was Rakdos? Well, in short, he was a sorcerer warlock multiclass, but he didn't feel like it. I prefer to play melee characters, and I definitely have a thing for Gish characters. I like the idea of combining spells as well as martial attacks. When I was told that we were going to be taking on Ravenloft, my first thought was Paladin. Paladins are great against creatures of undead origin, and there's a lot of those in Ravenloft. But I didn't want to be the stereotypic white knight, just because that kind of felt a little straightforward, so I was looking for a twist. Now I forget exactly how I decided on it, but essentially the theme I chose to build around was creating this paladin knight-like character who had a flaming sword. Specifically, I wanted to build around the idea of the Flame Swordsman from Yu-Gi-Oh! Paladin, of course, had been my first thought, because not only would they be good against undead in Ravenloft, but they got access to the elemental weapon spell, which would let me have an on-demand flaming sword. But for one reason or another that I don't completely remember, I didn't end up going with Paladin specifically. I didn't like the level breakdown, or just felt that it wasn't quite right. This is where Xanathar's Guide to Everything comes in. Hexblade was a new Warlock subclass that had just been released, thanks to Xanathar's Guide to Everything, and while I was skimming through the book looking for other ideas, while thinking Paladin might be the way to go, I noticed that on the Hexblade spell list, they get Elemental Weapon, and they get it at level 5 instead of level 9 when a Paladin gets it. Then following that, the reason I chose Sorcerer as a secondary class is because number one, it synergizes very, very well with Warlock, thanks to them both being charisma-based casters. And two, it helped our spell slots even out as well. I ended up being a Warlock 6, Sorcerer 4 split. So Warlock 6 gave me 2 third level spell slots that could come back on a short rest, and then Sorcerer 4 gave me 4 first level spell slots and 3 second level spells. So all in all, I felt like a regular half caster. Also, for this campaign, I was able to use Unearth Arcana in the build, so I was able to pick up the Phoenix Sorcerer, which is an Unearth Arcana subclass that to this day I still love. Phoenix Sorcerer has an ability called Mantle of Flame, and it's absolutely nuts, though not overpowered. For 1 minute, once per long rest, you can wreathe yourself in flame, and during that minute, whenever you roll fire damage on your turn, you add your charisma modifier to the fire damage rolled. Plus, if any creature touches or hits you while within 5 feet of you, they also take damage equal to your charisma. So already this was a really neat feature to build around that synergized with Elemental Weapon and could really make us feel like this Flame Swordsman. Pairing this with Hexblade as well to pick up Elemental Weapon means that I could use Charisma for my primary attack stat. I ended up picking a longsword and just wielding it with 2 hands, that way I could leave my other hand open for casting if I really wanted to, and it allowed me to essentially deal 1d10 plus Charisma modifier, plus a d4 from Elemental Weapon, plus Charisma modifier again because it added to the fire damage. With Thirsting Blade, the invocation that lets you attack twice with your packed weapon, because of course I went packed to the blade, this added up to a lot of nice average damage, for at least a minute in combat when we had Mantle of Flame up. But it gets better. Rakdos was also a Tiefling. I decided to go Tiefling because they get a few things that synergize with fire damage as well. They got access to the Flames of Phlegethos feat. And then, since we were a Warlock 6, Sorcerer 4 split, for my second ability score improvement / feat, I ended up picking up Elemental Adept. These 2 feats put together really synergized well with our fire damage. The main combo being that we were able to re-roll any ones that we rolled on spells we cast with fire damage. That's thanks to Flames of Phlegethos. Then with Elemental Adept, we can count any ones that we do roll as 2s. Plus, thanks to Elemental Adept, we can ignore resistance to fire damage that enemies may have when we're dealing fire damage. So already our average damage was spiking pretty nicely. And the way this all worked in practice at the table, at least with my DM, was that if I cast Elemental Weapon, for example, and made it fire damage, number 1, Flames of Phlegethos triggered, which I'll get to in a sec, plus anytime I would deal fire damage with it, because it was a spell I had cast at one point. The feat doesn't say you only reroll when you cast the spell, so with a little bit of leniency, that means that anytime I attacked with that flaming sword, I was able to reroll the 1s on fire damage. And then, if I still rolled a 1, that 1 was actually a 2. It was basically the way that the DM and I agreed that it would work. The second half of this build came in with Retaliate. Flames of Phlegethos also has an effect that allows you to wreathe yourself in flames whenever you cast a spell that deals fire damage. Then, as long as you have those flames up, if an enemy hits you while they're in melee with you, they take an automatic 1d4 fire damage. So if I was in melee and someone hit me while I had Mantle of Flame up and I had just cast a fire spell, then all of a sudden I would deal 1d4 plus charisma modifier for damage directly to them, no attack roll, no nothing. Overall, that was the general idea of Rakdos' build. Use these two casters that synergize well to actually become a Gish that swings a flaming sword and can deal a lot of damage. We were a bit of a glass cannon, but we could certainly hit like a cannon. In the end, Rakdos really only made it to like level 13 or 14 from level 10, but if I had continued, I would have eventually loved to have gotten the Life Drinker invocation from being a Warlock 12 to add even more charisma modifiers worth of damage as necrotic damage, which is also how Rakdos got his name. Not only did the two classes of Sorcerer and Warlock synergize really well with all the fire damage and the feats, but also because Warlock paired so well and all the necrotic elements that Hexblade has access to showed up too, it was a really neat pairing to be fire focused, but also technically necrotic or undead focused. I was able to raise specters, use Hexblade's curse. I could cast Hex if I wanted to, but not if I wanted to have elemental weapon up. And eventually I would have gotten Life Drinker to add necrotic damage onto the weapon attacks, so it would be both fire and necrotic damage being dealt on the same swing. All in all, that's just to say I named him after the Cult of Rakdos from Magic the Gathering. He felt like his mechanics and themes synergized perfectly. Plus, when I was actually leveling him up, the few times I did, his level ups were actually pretty interesting. I wanted to keep the spell slots on track as evenly as possible, so I would have to jump between the two classes whenever I leveled up. An example of this would be at Warlock 7, my 3rd level spell slots would become level 4, so then the next level I would have to jump up a level in Sorcerer to get to Sorcerer 5 in order to get those 3rd level spell slots back and feel like I was still advancing as just a half caster. For those few levels, he was very fun to play. But that kind of leads me into what exactly happened to him. So the rest of this video is now just going to be telling some fun D&D stories as well as what happened to Rakdos, but not every story is going to be about Rakdos. So if you just wanted to see the build and sort of learn about the character, then feel free to exit now, I won't take any offense. But if you want to hear a few funny D&D stories, feel free to sit back and let's go through them. So I suppose the first story to tell is when our party in Ravenloft ran into the Dark Carnival. The way our DM ran the Dark Carnival was basically that there were a bunch of games and attractions and relatively difficult challenges that we could partake in, but 2 attractions really stood out for us. That was a thing called the Die of Destiny, as well as the Deck of Many Things. Essentially, there were these stalls at the carnival where you could pay money to either draw a card from the Deck of Many Things or roll this Die of Destiny. The Die of Destiny, I believe, was a homebrew thing he made up, but I could be wrong about that. And essentially all it was you roll a d6, and on a 1 or a 2, something really bad happens. On a 3 or a 4, it was a neutral outcome. And on a 5 or a 6, it was a really good outcome. I don't remember what each individual outcome was, but I do remember that I and another party member each rolled the same either 3 or 4, which was basically a roll that made your character change their race. And I say race because it wasn't changing like your player character lineage to another player character lineage. It was after you rolled this result of 3 or 4 on the Die of Destiny, you then roll a d20, which the DM then consulted a chart that referenced the monster manual and monster types. You could become anything from a beast, or you could become something like a full dragon, beholder, mind flayer. I ended up rolling a monstrosity and became a minotaur. And the DM was nice. I got to choose whether I wanted to become a monster manual minotaur or whether or not I wanted to become a player lineage minotaur. I elected for Monster Manual because you still got to keep all of your class abilities and stats that you would have as a character. It's just that your race changed. So that did mean that I lost Flames of Phlegethos, which even though on paper it's just like a little reroll 1 ability and you get a little retaliation effect, it actually did feel like a big chunk of Rakdos' build, and that's where the decline kind of started. Even though I could still be a Flame Swordsman as a Minotaur, it just didn't feel the exact same. And so eventually, being a Minotaur with no real easy way to revert back to a tiefling, it kind of lost its luster, and at one point, Rakdos did have a pretty good cinematic moment where he did end up dying afterwards, and I just felt it was a good end to his character, and I decided to come back and play something completely different. Alright, so the first of our two relatively funny D&D stories comes from back when Rakdos got turned into a Minotaur. See, he wasn't the only one that rolled the Die of Destiny. The other character who also rolled the same result to get their race changed was our monk, Atlas. Atlas ended up getting changed into a weasel. And at first, this was just pretty funny. Atlas's player, however, was understandably not the most enthusiastic about playing the rest of the campaign as a weasel, so he decided to try his luck at the Deck of Many Things. Because there is a card, if I remember correctly, that essentially allows you to undo a recent event that has happened. This was the card that Atlas decided to start fishing for in order to try and undo his transformation into a weasel. The first card he drew was the Star. For those that don't know, the Star, or at least the card I'm thinking of, allows you to just permanently increase an ability score of your choice by +2. This was pretty nice in terms of both the fact that he pulled that instead of something worse, and because it's a free ability score increase. And the way that our DM was playing this set of Deck of Many Things, given that it was part of the carnival, when you pulled a card, that card went right back into the deck so someone else could draw it. And that actually happened again. A few of our other players decided to switch off, taking turns drawing from the Deck of Many Things, and Atlas, sure enough, ended up drawing again, and the second time, he drew the Star. So 2 times in a row was pretty funny, and we started making jokes about how he could become the perfect character if he just kept drawing the Star, because he could increase all of his ability scores by +2, and as a monk, you kind of want a whole bunch of ability scores to be really high. Sure enough, the third time he went to draw from the Deck of Many Things, he got the Star again. And this is completely random because the DM himself was rolling on a random number generator, which then popped out a number that correlated with the specific card. By the time he got that third Star card, we were all rolling, laughing just at how ridiculous it was and how lucky Atlas was getting, but also how silly it was because he was still a weasel that now just had really high ability scores. On his fourth draw, though, he ended up pulling the Skull, or whichever Deck of Many Things cards summons the Avatar of Death. And the Avatar of Death is not an enemy that messes around. It is designed to try and kill you. It essentially summons this powerful entity that is going to try and fight you to the death, and you either have to defeat it or find some other way to avoid it. The trick is, though, that your allies can't really help you fight the thing. They can, but if they do, then extra avatars of death will get summoned up and start fighting them as well. So really, it's meant to be a solo 1v1 fight. And the thing about that is that even though Atlas was a weasel staring down this avatar of death, the Grim Reaper itself, essentially, he was still a monk. He hadn't lost any of his class levels or abilities, and he didn't really need weapons because he was a monk. And because he was a monk, he could do unarmed strikes, and those unarmed strikes counted as magical for overcoming resistances. So all of a sudden, he just took on death. Made for a pretty intense fight because we didn't know how exactly it was going to go, and it ended up going really well. He just slapped death around. He threw out flurry of blows, a few stunning strikes, which I believe worked, or at least the DM allowed for them to work. And really, in about 2-3 rounds, the Avatar of Death was gone. It made for a really entertaining time at the table just because of how high the stakes were, but also because of how ridiculous it was to think that a weasel was defeating the literal embodiment of death. So while that first story admittedly wasn't about Rakdos, it did come from the campaign and was one of the more memorable moments in the campaign. And I think when you sit down at the table to play, it doesn't really matter what build you brought to the table, because those moments are going to be what you actually remember years down the road. To highlight that even more, a story that is actually about Rakdos is something that I will admit I was not expecting to have happened, and in hindsight, probably should have tried to avoid it, but it happened anyways. Basically, as we were doing this tour of the various domains on the campaign and just traveling from place to place, eventually our DM let us travel to this little island city, which was homebrewed, I'm pretty sure. I don't think it existed in the original Dark Domains of Ravenloft, because it really wasn't a Dark Domain. It was kind of our DM's way of giving us a metropolis refuge to be able to buy magic items, have a little bit more downtime, and just not have the ever-present threat of death. It was still dangerous, it just wasn't a Dark Domain. When we got there, though, we were kind of strapped for cash. So, Rakdos, with his loose morals, and a fellow fighter who also had relatively loose morals, got a relatively silly idea on how to make some quick cash. Because this was a port city and a busy metropolis, we decided to take part in working the streets, as it were. And after just a single night of rolling, we made a few checks, and sure enough, Rakdos did find a patron for his services. It ended up being a little old lady who had quite a large amount of wealth and was looking to spend it in order to sort of relive some of her lost youth, shall we say. So Rakdos, being Rakdos and only really wanting the money, went along with it. Alex, on the other hand, was kind of thinking, what am I getting myself into here? But sure enough, we went through with it. We didn't really roleplay or anything like that, obviously, but after the DM called for a check on my end, I forget if it was performance or constitution or something like that, he made a check of his own for the elderly NPC woman. And now the thing to keep in mind is that Rakdos was a Minotaur, and not just a player character Minotaur, he was a Monster Manual size large Minotaur. So that translated to pretty much everything. And sure enough, even though I made my constitution or performance check, the lady didn't. So all of a sudden, this character, this brainchild of mine that had been all about being this amazing flame swordsman, was there in this random building after needing a quick bit of cash with a recently passed on elderly woman who had just had the time of her life. And what did I do? Well, like any good loose moraled character would, I grabbed the cash, left, and that next day the party hitched a boat and sailed away from this metropolitan haven. Because honestly, any dark domain would be better to deal with than whatever sort of embarrassment or situation that the DM could have concocted from that shenanigans. That's pretty much it. Those are the two main memorable highlights, or at least the ones that had some pretty big laughs at the table that I can remember from that campaign. It was a fun time, and like I said, Rakdos didn't really last much longer than that. Pretty much after we left the island, there was like maybe 1 or 2 more sessions before he ended up meeting a relatively graceful end, and then I ended up switching to a new character. So I think that's something else that can really be shown in practice for character builds, is that even if you design a very interesting character that you do have fun playing, it doesn't mean they're going to be what you want to play forever. There's going to be other ideas, other things to try out, and you're going to move on in a different way that fits well with the narrative. But thank you so much for coming on the journey with me. Thank you for sticking with me through this 500 subscriber milestone, and I hope to see you in the next one.